Welcome back. I'm Traben, and in today's video, we'll be looking at everything I read in the month of July. Now, I have done my due diligence this month. I have all my books organized. Last month, we did just straight, what are the 3 stars, what are the 4 stars, what are the 5 stars, with no rhyme or reason. This month, I have my books set up, and I have my comics set up. We're going to do books first, 3, 4, 5, and then we'll do comics, 3, 4, 5. So let me know if that organization works for you. I didn't get a lot of feedback on my last video as far as was it working for people, how they wanted to be organized. I just thought this would probably work best, and it helps to be talking consistently about one media versus another. So we're going to start with the 3-star reads, and I'm going to get Threads That Bind out of the way first because I've already done a complete review video for this. This hit a 3-star, which is so-so, it's okay. I felt like the world building was a little bit clunky, but the potential was really high. And so if you'd like to get my thoughts on this, if you'd like to see a more elaborate explanation as to what I did and didn't like in Threads That Bind, check out that review video from last month. Next 3-star read was Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister. This one was a mystery thriller book where the character is continuously going back in time in her own life and reliving these days backwards. And the premise was really compelling, and I feel like that is the strongest element in this story. The actual mystery, the actual thriller part of it was very dry. It was very by the numbers, things I've seen in fiction a million times, and I don't really feel like it ever reached a climax in that aspect of it. There's always this tension of how far back in time is she going to end up having to go. But as far as resolving the central issue, figuring out what the central issue is, and then solving it, there really wasn't a satisfying climax in the book. And the ending is problematic in the time travel genre tropes. So I won't elaborate any further than that. I feel like the gimmick here is very interesting, but it's wrapped around a story that is not very compelling. Finally, for 3 stars, unfortunately, we have the Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. And this one was a disappointment for me because it's one of the secret project books. It was something I was really excited about. I really enjoyed all the extra little art pieces that were throughout the book, and they also told a story as you progressed through the book. But unfortunately, I feel like this just wasn't what I was hoping for. And Sanderson addresses it in the afterwards of the book, explaining that of the 4 secret projects, this is the one that is not part of the Cosmere. It's not even really fantasy. It's more of a sci-fi story. I didn't find the protagonist compelling. I think it's telling that the bookmark you received with this crate was not even the main character. The standout moment of the book is for one of the supporting characters who was far more interesting. And so, yeah, unfortunately, this scores a 3. I don't feel like much about this book is going to stick with me. The premise was somewhat interesting. We had that kind of fish out of water beginning to the story where we had to kind of figure out what was going on as the character did. But much like with Wrong Place, Wrong Time, the answers we got were also just not that interesting. So unfortunate, but this scored a 3 for me. We're up to the 4-star reads for this month, 4-star books. And we're going to start with The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. Now, this is one of the cozy fantasy stories that has been getting a lot of attention. It is a romance, or at least it is in the romance section of my Barnes & Noble. And while I would say that the relationship between Mika and Jamie is one of the central pillars of the story, we also have a lot in here that deals with found family. We have a lot in here about duty to yourself versus duty to a collective. And it's all wrapped up in a story that some might find a little light. And I know a lot of the complaints with the book that I read were about how the magic system is very loose and how the characters are very shallow. But I feel as a result of that, result of using these archetypes and being very loose with the world building, that it allowed it to maintain this comfortable atmosphere throughout. And I really enjoyed it. It was just a really cozy read, and I would definitely recommend it if you're a fan of something like Legends and Lattes. This was kind of my second foray into cozy fantasy after reading that book, and it's another one that I would highly recommend. So that's our first 4-star. The Whisper Man actually went down from a 5-star to a 4-star when I was compiling my list, because I just didn't remember why I had rated it so high. It's certainly a good detective mystery. It's kind of a slow burn, and again, I know that was the complaint with the book in circles like Goodreads, was that a lot doesn't seem to happen at the beginning, but we're developing characters, we're developing relationships, we're developing the atmosphere of the story. My biggest complaint with this one would probably be that it's another one of these books that seems to hint at a supernatural element and play around with that. And I was coming across so many of those, one after the other, that were then not following through with that promise. The supernatural element was nothing. It was all explained away later in the book, and I really didn't care for that, because part of the reason why I picked this up is I had asked for a genuinely scary book, and I thought this was going to bring those kind of supernatural scares, and it didn't. And while I can see how this would be frightening, especially if you are a parent, I just it just didn't do that for me. It ranks so high because it is a good mystery, and it does do a good job of creating atmosphere. But ultimately, I had to knock it down a peg because I didn't remember why I thought it was outstanding. I feel like it was probably a 4.5. I rounded it up to a 5, and now I'm rounding it back down to a 4. So it's good. It's very good. It's solidly written. It's just not attaining the heights of my 5-star reads for this month. Speaking of a book that landed between 2-star ratings, and I had to make a decision of whether to bump it up or bump it down, we have The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. Now, this is a debut novel by this writer, if I'm not mistaken. And the main issue with this book is that it is very muddled and confused about what it wants to be. It's, again, a book with these supernatural elements tied into it. This at least has the explanation built in as to why those supernatural elements end up not being supernatural elements. But what the book seems to be at the start of the story, what it builds to be for 3/4 of the story, is not where it ends up. And where it ends up is so bonkers that I did not care for it. It didn't feel like a cohesive novel. It didn't feel like a cohesive story. And I know some other booktubers are fans of these more outlandish, ridiculous thriller stories. And I can be. I thought the last word was really interesting, and that's really super campy. But this just didn't do it for me. And I think the major issue is with the consistency of like what kind of story it wants to be. So ultimately ended up at the 4. I think it was a 3.5, and I rounded it up because I just didn't feel like it was down to the level of a 3-star. I felt like it felt more at home in my 4-star reads. Another thriller, another 4-star. They're just falling apart at the end. Seems to be a very common trend with these modern thriller stories. I read The Only One Left by Riley Sager for Book Troop read along for this month, and I still haven't watched the stream yet. I was occupied when the stream was happening. And so I'm not sure what the consensus there was, but for me, this book is following a trend that I'm seeing in modern thrillers, in which by the end of the story, every detail has to, in some way, be significant, and all of it has to tie together. And it becomes more and more unlikely as these different threads come together that like everything lined up and everybody was in some way significant to the story. There's also just some like general ideas in here that just don't work. They don't make any sense if you think about them for too long. I really liked the premise, and again, for about 3/4 of the book, I was behind it. Even as the reveals started, I was with it. And then the reveals didn't stop, and they didn't stop. And they just kept going with like, saying that all these different things that you thought were happening were different than they were. And it becomes exhausting and becomes so silly. The Last Word did something similar where it kind of fell apart at the end with the plot twists. I'm a little worried because I want to read more of these modern thrillers, but I don't want to read them if they're going to end up imploding like they do at the end. So, again, solid book for 3/4 of the way through. Bungled the ending a little bit, just became a little bit too much. But still, I liked it. I still thought it was fun, and I would still definitely recommend it if you are a fan of this type of writing. It just wasn't a 5-star. It didn't quite get to that level. The 3 audiobooks I read for this month also all scored 4 out of 5 stars for me. I read Onyeka and the Academy of the Sun, which was X-Men by way of maybe Black Panther. It's about a superhero group in Nigeria, I believe, is the main center of power in that world. And the main character who has come to her powers later than everybody else and has serves as that kind of fish out of water for everyone to explain how the world works and how her powers work. It's a young reader book, so it's nothing that was like phenomenal from a storytelling perspective. It's all very comfortable and fairly predictable, but I will say that I feel like the audiobook production is amazing. And if this is a title that you've been looking at, I would highly recommend you go seek out the audiobook because the reader they got for the book is able to adopt the various accents that the characters have. It reminds you constantly of the culture that is being represented here, which I think is one of the most important things this book was trying to accomplish. We had Marina by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This one got 4 stars because I felt like, again, parts of the early bit of it dragged. It is a Gothic horror story, and so a lot of the prose was fairly verbose, but the end just hit so hard. The end was gut wrenching. I would recommend this if you are someone who enjoyed something like the death of Jane Lawrence and you're looking for another gothic horror story with elements of romance in it, a little bit of the macabre or the supernatural at play. It's a good one. It just, again, did not quite reach 5 stars because I felt like parts of it were dragging a bit. I read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. This is something that my partner and I got when we were up in Idaho on these long trips between different parts of the state. And we had previously read the guest list or listened to the guest list as an audiobook. And this is Foley's first book. It suffers from being very similar structurally. And so we were able to figure out the main antagonist, which is part of the mystery of the story, fairly quickly. We kind of knew where the story was heading, and that dampened the enjoyment slightly. We were just waiting for the penny to drop rather than being surprised by what happens later in the book. But if you enjoy Lucy Foley's work, then this is another one that will give you the same experience as the guest list. I have not read The Paris Apartment. I know that The Paris Apartment is the one book from this author that tends to get the lower ratings, but it seems to have a very similar premise of all these terrible people are locked in together, and we're slowly going to unwind their relationships and reveal the darker, horrible things that are happening between members of this group until someone winds up dead, and then we'll find out who the murderer is. And so, because it felt because it fell in line so much with the guest list, I felt like it was only right to give it about the same rating. I would probably say it's not as strong as the guest list. I think the guest list was Foley's second attempt at this very similar story and was a better, more polished piece of work as a result of what she learned from this first book. So what were my 5-star reads for the month of July? So to start off, we have The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is a reread for me. I read this back in high school. It's just absurdist sci-fi. Like, the things that happen in this book are so wild and off the wall. And it's not trying to be anything deeper. It's not trying to be realistic in any stretch of the imagination. And so it's just a very fun read. It's also only about 200 pages, so you can get through it in a sitting. And yeah, I think I would recommend this to anybody who's a fan of sci-fi. If anyone who's a fan of a kind of weird British humor, the dry humor. Glad I reread this because there were some details in here that I don't remember reading when I was back in high school, and I would really like to pick up the rest of the series in this format so that I can reread the whole thing now. Finally, for 5-star reads, we have Dark Matter. Now, this is not without its flaws. I know a lot of people point out the clunky explanations of science in this. Blake Crouch tends to have these interesting premises that kind of fall apart later on in the story. I did feel like there was a single moment at the end of the book where something happens that's just incredibly convenient, and I feel like Crouch had almost written himself into a corner and was like, okay, well, either this has to happen, which is super easy for the main character to overcome, or I have to write like another 300 pages, this really elaborate problem that happens toward the end of the book. Overall, I felt like the premise was very interesting. I liked the multiple worlds storyline it had going. Yes, it was very loose with the explanations and with the science part of it, but that's not why I read it. I read it for a weirdo story about a guy who gets kidnapped by his doppelganger. Definitely one I would recommend, again, if you're a fan of sci-fi, if you're a fan of alternate universe movies, that type of thing. This would definitely be a strong recommendation for me if that is your thing. Moving on to comics. Again, 3, 4, 5 ratings in comics. Starting with the threes, I only got 1 3 for this month, and that is Never Open It by Ken Nimura. Now, this one I read as part of my research on a video of the illusions made in Six Crimson Cranes. It is another book that has different adaptations of these classic Japanese folklore or fairy tale stories with a little bit of a twist. So if you are familiar with those stories, you can get a little bit of a difference between the classic tellings of the stories and what happens in this book. I do think it has a very stark use of color. Most of the paneling is black and white, and then with each story, there's an element or two that is this very vibrant red. But I did not care for the art in general. I felt like that was a very interesting, creative choice, but the art style itself was just too simplistic for me. I did not care for it. The twists in the stories range from mildly interesting to confusing to read. So I think your mileage may vary. I think it's a stronger book if you're already familiar with the stories that it is adapting. Because it is making changes to the stories, you can appreciate those changes only if you know what the original was. So it's not something I'd recommend to a lot of people. I don't really care for the art, and the stories were things I had experienced before. The twists were okay. So that's why it wound up as 3. In 4-star reads, we'll go ahead and do a whole bunch of Blue Lock. So Blue Lock Volume 2, Volume 4, Volume 6, and Volume 7 all scored a 4 from me. Blue Lock is a manga about an insane attempt to create a strong Japanese forward in soccer by creating this lock room tournament between between the strongest high school students. What really drives the story is the characters, and overall, I've really been enjoying it. So those all hit 4 stars. Um, they were all solid volumes. The interesting things going on. It's like watching an entire show of the training arc of your typical shonen manga, which is really my favorite part. And so I find that really interesting and really amusing. It's also a sports manga, which is something that I really do enjoy reading. I've read some Ice Shield, I've read some Kuroko no Basket, and I've read a little bit of Haikyuu. And so I think mixing those two concepts of the sports manga and like the training arc is just really fun. And so it's a joy to read. Also coming in at 4 stars is Kaiju number 8, volume 7. So Kaiju number 8 is doing a good job right now in creating a continuing narrative. I was really concerned for a while because all the volumes were feeling kind of samey, with just a kaiju shows up and they go attack it and they win, but there's some sort of minor problem. Now we are raising the stakes. There was a very significant event in this story that leads to a reason why the current generation of trainees is so important, and why we are going to shift our focus to the characters that we've already been establishing rather than talk about the veteran monster hunters, veteran kaiju slayers in this world. So I feel like it's doing a good job of continuing the narrative while keeping the focus on the characters that they want to develop. This is another one where characterization really matters. If you identify with the characters, if you identify with the ones that are getting focus for a given volume, then you'll probably enjoy that volume a little bit more than others. So I'm still going to stick with this one. I really enjoy it, and I look forward to seeing what is in store in the future for Kaiju number 8. From Kaiju to Kaiji, I read Kaiji number 4, which is a manga about gambling addicts having to take these extreme measures to get rid of their debt. Now, this entire volume, which is a pretty thick read, is all just a walk from one building, the top of one building, to the top of another building. And so normally Kaiji would get a 5-star from me, but this volume in particular, they weren't doing anything clever with the task that they were having to do. They've had previous arcs where there was a rock, paper, scissors tournament, or there was some sort of gambling going on in which they could, through clever play, gain some sort of advantage. But with this particular task, with this particular challenge, there was none of that. This was a lot more meditating on existential crises and had a lot of talk about how we're all isolated and alone, but calling out to others, even if your words are can never be truly understood, gives you hope and gives you confidence for the future. And that's very much what this series is about. But there wasn't anything more. There wasn't anything particularly clever in this volume, and so it got knocked down a peg from some of the other issues that I've read of Kaiji. I am looking forward to the next volume, which isn't going to release until next year, 2024, because it's another one of those gambling games where there will be some clever play between Kaiji and his opponent. So I look forward to that. Again, this one a little bit lackluster in this series of comics. I read Nimona this month. I picked this up at a Walmart after my friend talked about how much he enjoyed the movie that's currently on Netflix. I will say that I feel like the movie and the book are different enough that you could read both. You could enjoy both. I feel like ultimately the movie is stronger. There's something more cohesive about it. This one has a little bit more of a disjointed narrative, has a little bit more ambiguity with a number of the character relationships and with the ending, but I still really liked it. I love Nimona and all of her chaos, the way that she just wants to immediately go toward fighting and killing and maiming the opponents was played up for laughs, and I feel like it worked well. And the comic did a good job again of creating these characters, getting you to care about them very quickly, getting you invested in the story. This one drops you into the story a lot faster than the movie. Ultimately, they're telling the similar stories. They're hitting on similar themes, but I would say watch the Netflix movie, and if you enjoyed it, then go pick up the comic, because again, I think you could do both. I think both are enjoyable. And again, this ended up as 4 stars, so it's still strong. Finally, at my 4-star ratings, we have Night Eaters Volume 1, They Eat the Night. The art on this is absolutely beautiful, and that's the art that you can expect from throughout the book. Okay. The story here, this is a Marjorie Liu book, and the story here is good. Uh, I will say it might be something that benefits from future volumes and elaborating on the premise that is set up here, because some of this book is very confusing until you get to the end and you realize what has happened. And I will say that other than one moment with this like haunted house vibe that you get about halfway through the book, or possibly a little bit further than halfway, um, not a lot's happening in here that's really scary. And I read this as part of Summerween. I was looking forward to something that was a little bit more creepy and frightening, and there's definitely those elements in here. It wasn't hitting me as strong as, say, Something is Killing the Children or Bunny Mask. And so, because of that, I rated it 4 stars. I still think it's a strong book. I think if you're a fan of Marjorie Liu and the kinds of stories that she tells, if you know about Monstrous, this has a similar vibe to it. And so I would definitely recommend picking it up if you're a fan of the writer. Finally, we have 5-star reads. All right. So if you're paying attention, you'll note that there were a couple of volumes of Blue Lock missing from the 4-star ratings. And that is because volume 3 and volume 5 of Blue Lock got 5-star ratings for me. Volume 3 goes through a certain character's backstory who I really liked. It is the person featured on the cover here, Chigiri. I won't go into much of it because I want to avoid spoilers, but it took a character that was very aloof and enigmatic and gave them a backstory that was compelling and made that character one of my favorites for the current arc that was happening. And then volume 5 was the end of the first round of the training tournament that we have going on. The stakes were very high. The characters are constantly evolving and getting stronger. And it had some moments in it that were like that were building upon everything that had come before. So this is really a climactic moment for the manga, and I think that it did well in delivering on the promises made in the previous volumes, in wrapping that up in a very satisfying way, in a mostly believable way. We are talking about a shonen action sports manga, but within that realm and within the things established about this world, I feel like this pulled off a very satisfying end to the arc. Space Battle Lunchtime, volumes 2 and 3 also get 5-star. Now, I talked about getting these in on an unboxing video recently. I basically read them, I think, the next day, and I still absolutely love this series. It gives me such Saturday morning cartoon vibes. Now, I was surprised to find out that the end of volume 2 basically wraps up the entire story established in volume 1. It introduces some new characters, which some of them are hit or miss, but the overall story is still very satisfying. I still loved watching the character struggle with the absolute craziness that her life has become. And then volume 3 is set sometime after the first 2 volumes when she's become much more stable. The relationship between these two is a lot stronger, but it does address a dangling plot point that was not resolved in the first 2 issues. And so, again, because it's giving me those Saturday morning cartoon vibes, and because I love the characters so much, that ended up being a 5-star read. We're going to continue with this idea of characters bumping up stories to 5-star reads. I read Supermassive this month, which is the Massiveverse crossover from 2022. I have previously talked about my love for the Supermassive comics and pretty much go through every single title in that line and talk about what I love about it, what I dislike about it, rate all of them at the end of that video. This saw the 3 main lines at the time, which are Inferno Girl Red, Radiant Black, and Rogue Sun, team up in a crossover event that, again, is very reminiscent of the tokusatsu shows that are informing this entire aesthetic. They meet, they fight for a while, there's a big threat, they all team up. This book knows exactly what it is, and then once they're done, they just go their separate ways. And it's nothing. If I'm being objective, if I can separate myself from my love of these characters and my love of this genre, it's almost nothing, right? It's a by the numbers crossover event story. There's nothing. There's no big reveals in this one or anything like that. But it knows exactly what it is. What I appreciate about this is, unlike the main 2 in Marvel and DC, when they have these crossover events and everything in their entire company has to like warp around those events, this is just like a one-off. You don't have to read this. Like nothing of consequence happens in this story to affect these characters, but you do get a little bit of a glimpse of the future, some potential future plot lines that they might get into later, and you get like one of the coolest spreads I have seen in a comic in a while. So there they are, all transforming, and then uh, again, they know exactly what they're doing with these books. Look at this. Folds out, you get this huge spread of the three of them transformed into their suits. Amazing. I love it. Again, will totally admit my bias on that, but that was a 5-star read for me, and a short one. It's a single comic, maybe a little bit longer than a typical comic read. Continue with the bias, bumping up those points. Okay, Miss Marvel Beyond the Limit. This was the last Miss Marvel comic. Might be the second to last Miss Marvel comic that I did not own. It's a one-off story. It deals with the source of Miss Marvel's powers and the idea of a multiverse. And again, it would probably be a 4-star read, except for I love Miss Marvel. And so it gets bumped up to a 5-star because I love the character. I love the lore. I love seeing these characters interact with one another. This was another 5-star read for me, seeing Kamala get involved in another crazy dilemma. I thought the villain for this one, at least the setup for who the villain was one of the more interesting things that's been done in Miss Marvel in a while. And I have some concerns about the resolution. I kind of hope this comes back at some point because I feel like this, more than a lot of Miss Marvel comics in the past, has set up a good potential for continuing the story in some other arc down the way. Finally, in 5-star comic book reads, we have Something is Killing the Children, Volume 5 and Volume 6. This continues to be just an amazing story. After the flashback volume that was Volume 4, these start up a new arc with a further complication for Erica Slaughter in that she is now being pursued by the group that she works for, in addition to having to deal with an even stronger monster. The monster in this one is able to like take on the form of other people, and the longer it does that, the more people it consumes, the better it gets at doing that. This arc is not resolved. I don't think the resolution is going to get into a trade paperback until next year, and I'm just like so hyped for it. I want to read it so bad. This might be one that I end up, if I can, starting to pick up the single issues, just because I would so like to keep up with the story and know what's happening. I also would not object to buying the special edition versions of the book, which means I would buy this 3 times. That's what greater endorsement can you give? I would buy this book 3 times. I would buy the monthlies, and then I would buy the TPBs, and then when they come up with the special editions, I'd buy that too. So if you have not read Something is Killing the Children and you are looking for a horror-themed story, a horror-themed comic book, I think this is one of the strongest on the market right now. Thank you for coming with me on this journey through all the books I read this month. As always, I hope your reading journey is going well. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Help us grow this corner of our BookTube community. And let me know, have you read any of these books? Is there anything that you agree with me, disagree with me? Is there anything that I discussed that looks interesting to you that you'd like to talk about? Post it down in the comments, and I would be more than happy to discuss any of these books. With that being said, hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on the next one.